So our lecture tonight is titled An Investigation of the Odyssean Home. And essentially we're looking at Odysseus himself as the main character and his home and all that that entails, and we'll get into that. So to start, an overview of Homer's Odyssey. If you've read it, this is a little bit of review for you. If you have not read it, I'm going to walk you through kind of the general idea. So the Odyssey is one of the oldest works in written literature. It's actually incredible that we still have the story today because it's roughly, they believe, 2,700 years old. So a 2,000 to 3,000 year old story, for it to be completely intact is miraculous almost in the eyes of historians. It has started as an oral story. So people would gather around much like this, and a storyteller would get up in front and share the story of the Odyssey. And it would be often in segments, so you'd come for a night, hear a couple sections of the story, and you'd have to tune in next time. So it was a fun way that storytelling happened in ancient Greece. And oftentimes at the end of books, as you're reading the Odyssey, it'll end in a cliffhanger. And it's fun to think that it was a cliffhanger for the people listening to the story as well. They're like, oh, I got to come back tomorrow and hear the bard tell the story. So one of the oldest works, but it is still so relevant today. It is saturated. The more you mine the story with truths of human experience, emotion, values, struggles, no matter who you are, when you read the Odyssey, you see things and you feel things that you know are real and that are true for the human experience, no matter who you are. So the story itself follows Odysseus' journey home from the Trojan War. The Odyssey is actually a sequel. The freshmen read it first because it's an easier story to digest, but it's a sequel to the Iliad, which was also written by Homer. And the Iliad recounts the story of the Trojan War. And then the Odyssey is Odysseus' return from that war. He's there for 10 years, and then it takes him another 10 years to get home. And we'll talk about the impact that that 20 years has on him. So as he journeys home, he faces monsters, he faces struggles on the sea, he faces the wrath of the gods, the favoritism of the gods. But we also get his family's perspective at the same time. So we watch his wife Penelope, his son Telemachus, even his father Laertes navigate his journey home as they wait for him to return. So we're going to focus on essentially Odysseus, his wife, and his son. And we're going to watch his longing for family and for home, but it clashes with his desire for glory. In ancient Greek times, the word kleos, which means renown or glory, was the thing that they strived for. Culturally, it was the most important value. In war, you strove for kleos. In your culture and your kingdom, you strove for kleos. Everything that people said about you, that people said to you about your reputation was the most important. So we're watching Odysseus in this story navigate his own kleos, and we watch it break down. And Homer does this incredible thing that's actually pretty countercultural at the time that says, kleos is not the most important thing, home is. And so we're going to walk through that today. So we'll focus on their family. We'll specifically talk about the home and the experience of waiting as they wait for home, and that's kind of how the breakdown of this lecture will be. Apologies to anyone currently reading the book. If you're part of a book club or you're doing it asynchronous, I am just going to spoil the ending. I don't feel too bad because it's almost 3,000 years old. The ending's pretty well known by now. But apologies anyway for spoilers. Hopefully it just motivates you to continue reading and see how it plays out. And my hope is to show just a glimpse to you of why the Odyssey has moved readers for thousands of years, why we still consider it a classic that should be read by people of all ages, and why it impacts readers no matter the generation. It's a pretty incredible story, and it is a deeply human story. So here we go. Let's get into it. So the Odyssey itself is in a genre of stories from ancient Greece that they call the nostoi. And the nostoi in Greek means the returns. And so essentially it's this category of stories that recounts the tales of the returns of the men who fought in the Trojan War as they're all returning back to their Greek homes. And it was quite the journey. The Trojan War happened in Troy, which is on the farthest side of Turkey. on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they're trying to get home from Turkey all the way back to their islands, or if they lived on the mainland of Greece. And that's a tough journey to make. Tougher for Odysseus than others, but tough in general. And so Odysseus is the most famous story. And it's called The Returns. And I love the Greek. I love going back to the roots of the words. And here we see the word nostos, which is where we get nostoi. Nostoi is the plural. The word nostos is kind of this return, but also a yearning of sorts. And when you mix it with the word algos, we get the word nostalgia. And nostalgia nowadays, for us modern people, it tends to be the idea of like, oh, I miss childhood. I miss what once was, kind of the warm, fuzzy feeling of nostalgia. But for ancient Greeks, nostalgia had more weight to it. Nostalgia for them was pain. It was the pain of yearning for home, for the past, and for what has been lost. And specifically yearning for home is what's happening here in the Odyssey. So this nostalgia, whenever I use it in this lecture, that's the kind of nostalgia I'm referring to. It's a deep ache. And so the story is Odysseus trying to get back home to Ithaca, experiencing this nostalgia throughout his entire 20-year journey, if you include the war. So homecoming is his central goal. He's trying to get back home. And to truly understand his return, his experience of nostalgia, we actually need to understand the ancient Greek view of home itself, because it's different from what we know nowadays. So home in ancient Greece is defined with the word oikos. Not the yogurt is kind of usually how we see it nowadays, like, oh yeah, oikos yogurt, Greek things. But here, basically the yogurt company said, that's a fun Greek word, let's eat home yogurt. But oikos here refers to home in a much broader sense than we talk about it. So nowadays we think house and home are two very different connotations. House, you think the literal structure that you live in. Home is where the heart is, as all the Hobby Lobby signs say. And so it has this emotional sense to it, a sense of belonging, a sense of feeling that comes with home. But the Greeks thought we don't need to differentiate between those two. Oikos is the one word that they use to talk about your literal dwelling place, the structure itself, to talk about your home in the sense that we think of it, the place that you belong, the place that you dwell and you feel safe. It talked about their household, so Odysseus, along with many of the people at his time, had servants, so everyone involved in your home was implied when you talked about oikos. Your family was implied. And so all of this, including the broader community, so for Odysseus, Ithaca, his people that he reigned over as he was the king, all of this is tied up in this word oikos. And it's fascinating to me because they use it so intentionally throughout the story and throughout Greek times, and it meant something deep and real and serious for them. To Greeks, oikos was essential for life. Your oikos, your home, your family, was the basic building block of society. And they believed that if your home was right and good and rightly ordered, then society was going to be rightly ordered. But when there's a breakdown of your oikos, there's going to be a breakdown of society. And we see that in this story. In the story, we begin not with Odysseus, which is surprising when you're like, oh, the Odyssey. Surely we'll read about Odysseus. You don't. You actually start with his son Telemachus on the island of Ithaca with his mother Penelope, Odysseus' wife. And Ithaca is a mess. It's broken. They have been raided, essentially, by suitors, 108 of them, who are all trying to vie for Penelope's hand in marriage because they think surely Odysseus has died at sea. And so these suitors are staying at the house of Odysseus. They're eating them out of house and home, and they're treating them terribly. And that's the first glimpse we get in this book. We get a glimpse of home as it shouldn't be. It's broken, it's a mess, and it is in desperate need of Odysseus. It's in desperate need of a father, of a husband, and of a leader. And so as we see the ideal of oikos, as modern readers or people who've lived life in any capacity, we recognize that home is not always this ideal. that the Greeks wanted it to be. Home is unfortunately sometimes broken, and it sometimes lacks the things that the Greeks believed the oikos should have. And so we get a glimpse of that in a dramatic way. We don't have 108 suitors in a broken home usually, but we get a glimpse of what does it look like for a home to not be whole. And so we watch them walk through that. So that's oikos. For Odysseus, home is Ithaca. Home is his wife, his son, his family, and he is desperately trying to get home to it. So not only does Odysseus experience this yearning, this nostalgia for his oikos, so do Penelope and Telemachus. We get a full experience of how this family is experiencing oikos, or the loss thereof. So for Odysseus, it's the most obvious. He's longing for home as he's trying to get back to Ithaca. Every step of the way, he keeps persevering. He keeps fighting these battles. For Penelope, it's more subtle. She is stuck within the constraints of her home. She can't leave. Society dictates that she has certain limitations. She does not have a lot of power in her home. But she's home and longing for it to return to what it was. She's longing for her husband who left 20 years ago and who she has not communicated with. She has no idea if he's alive. And then we have Telemachus, who was a baby when his father left for war, and by the end of the story, he's about 20 years old. And so he's lived an entire life longing for what he's told home should be, but he's never experienced it. And so he's trying to find a way to make it whole. So as each character longs for home in their own way, readers walk through the process of waiting for it with them. And we're drawn into their feelings and their experiences. The very first time we meet each of these characters, through separate chapters of the story, they weep. Odysseus weeps on an island that he's stuck on. Penelope weeps as tales of her husband are told. And Telemachus, as he steps up and tries to be the man of the house, crumbles and weeps under the pressure of it. And so we watch just a broken family who desperately want to get back together. And so what that waiting looks like for Odysseus is endless challenges and trials, constant obstacles that he is trying to face. For Penelope, her wait for Odysseus actually shows her strength in a really wonderful way. She's an often overlooked character. She seems a little more static at times, but what she does is within the boundaries of society, of ancient Greek society, she endures the suitor's presence. She holds on to hope. There's probably the tale that she's most famous for is that for the 3 to 4 years that the suitors are there, she tells them, yeah, I'll marry you. But you just gotta wait. And she says she has to weave a tapestry of a burial shroud for her father-in-law. And every day she weaves the tapestry, and every night she unweaves it. And so it looks like she's constantly making progress, but she's really undoing that progress. Finally, she gets caught, but what we see there is her waiting. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And the whole time she hopes against hope. Against everything that everyone says, she hopes that Odysseus will return, and she stays loyal, which is pretty incredible. And then Telemachus waits a lifetime for the return of his father, and he embodies the transformational experience of waiting. He goes on his own journey, and he is transformed, and he returns different because of it. So as we talk about waiting, we have two different kinds of waiting, essentially. And this is true for life, but it's very clear in this story. When a person waits, there is active waiting and there is passive waiting. Active waiting is exactly what it sounds like. You're doing things as you wait. Not meaningless things, not mindless things, but things that are propelling you towards your goal. And passive waiting is also what it sounds like. You kind of just sit back and you let life happen around you. You hope that maybe your goal is going to happen, or maybe you forget that your goal is going to happen or that you want it to. And so we see these two examples very clearly in these three characters. For Penelope, society dictates passivity. It expects her to be passive. But like I said, as she weaves that funeral shroud, she chooses to be active in her own way. She chooses to prolong the suitor's time at her house, enduring worse things because of that. But she does it because she's holding on to hope. So we see a very subtle active waiting there. For Telemachus, he's passive for years. He's a little boy who cannot step into the position that he wants to or that he is told he should. But then, thanks to the help of Athena, she prompts him to go on a journey where he begins to be active. He begins to look for answers about his father, to try to find out if he can get his father home. And so we start seeing him move into activity, into productivity. And then for Odysseus, he's fascinating in terms of waiting. You think that he would be the most motivated constantly to get home. And while he is, and we see active waiting happening, he actually is very passive at times as well. And there's 3 instances of that. 1 is not his fault. 2 are definitely his fault. The first is along their journey, him and his men, their ships land at the land of the lotus eaters, which is in northern Africa. And the lotus eaters have these lotus flowers that they consume, and it's basically a drug. And Odysseus's men eat them as well. And the text is really specific to say that Odysseus's men forget home. They don't forget their journey. They don't forget their goal. They forget home, oikos, specifically. And so the danger of passive waiting in that sense, of sitting back and saying, yeah, we'll just be here for a while on the journey, the danger is forgetting home, oikos, the thing that should be guiding them constantly. So that one's less Odysseus' fault. He moves the men out of it and propels them toward home. There's 2 other examples, though, where we do see Odysseus allowing himself to slip into passive waiting. One is on the island of Circe. She's a witch and a goddess. She has a lot of power, and to make a long story short, they land on her island. She turns a bunch of Odysseus' men into pigs, and he has to go rescue them. And so he goes and rescues them. He appeases Circe and decides to stay there for a year because it's comfortable, because she has food. She has a luxurious life. And here we see a year of waiting that did not need to happen. The journey could have been cut short by a year, but instead Odysseus, as the leader, decides that him and his men will stay and wait passively. And here again, they forget home because their immediate pleasures and immediate gratification is more appealing to them than the journey home, more appealing to them than what oikos has to offer. And then lastly, we get the story of Calypso. At the very end of the tale that Odysseus tells about his journey, his men have all died, and it is just him left, and he lands on the island of Calypso, which isn't his fault. He shipwrecks there. But he's there for 7.5, close to 8 years. He's stuck, but we only see him weeping for home 7 years into it when it says, Calypso ceased to please him. So we're not told exactly how long, but for a certain amount of time, he was perfectly content with being there. He's living on an island with a goddess who is kind of keeping him captive, but he doesn't have much of a problem with it, and he forgets home for a long period of time. And so we see him being passive sometimes, and we see the dangers of passive waiting on this journey. So, in this waiting, as they wait for the restoration of oikos, and we as readers wait alongside them, we're anticipating a lot. The very first stanza in the book, I'll just read it to you, pretty much spoils the ending of the journey, which is interesting. Whenever we read it with the kids, they're like, why did it just tell us the whole thing? And then we backtrack. But I'll read it to you and then explain the way that this influences waiting. So Homer starts the story by saying, tell me about a complicated man. And he calls on the muse of poetry, to inspire him. He says, Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes, they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. It's our first stanza of the story. So we as readers, before we meet any characters, we don't even have Odysseus' name yet here. We're already waiting for what's to come, for what we've been told is going to happen. We're told that he fails, that all of his men die, And we still don't know for sure if he makes it home, and so we're beginning with an anticipation. And then that waiting becomes a waiting for oikos, because right after this, we're introduced to Ithaca, and we're introduced to how broken it is and how desperately it needs Odysseus. So we, along with Odysseus' family, are watching his story and wanting it to go faster. We want him to get home quicker. And so those moments where he's passive feel extra frustrating for readers, because we know what he's missing at home, and we know how much they need him. So that's what's happening as we wait alongside, as we hope, along with the characters, for a restoration of oikos. And so we see the necessity of a rightly ordered oikos, and with that, a rightly ordered view of oikos, a recognition that oikos should be actively rather than passively waited for. And so it leads the audience, it leads us as readers to ponder these things. One, what happens when home is not as it should be, or when oikos is disordered? Two, in what ways does a broken oikos lead to societal instability? And what does it take to restore oikos itself? So finally, at the end of the story, we do get to see Odysseus return home. Each character by the end has been changed and refined by their experience of waiting for the return of Odysseus and the restoration of oikos, of home. And we see this emotional impact in one of the final scenes of the book. In the second to last book, we watch Odysseus return home to his wife, to his family. But it's tricky because his wife doesn't trust at all, really. She's been trained to be mistrustful of the gods, mistrustful of other people. She's very wary of tricks. And so as he comes home and he says, "It's me, I'm back," she doesn't believe him. And so she puts him up to a test relating to their bed. This is a bed, and it looks really weird, but I will explain it in just a second as to why it looks like this. So she tests him, and I'll show us a passage in which this happens. So a few excerpts from the book pieced together to narrate this story for you. And just read along as I read aloud. So Odysseus has returned home. He's trying to convince her that he is who he says he is. And to ensure it's him, she sets up a test as everyone prepares for bed. It's nighttime, and Penelope tells her maid, "Now, Eurycleia, make the bed for him outside the room he built himself. Pull out the bedstead and spread quilts and blankets on it." Odysseus responds, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult for even a master craftsman, though a god could do it with ease. No man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There's a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else. Inside the court, there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it and skillfully transformed the trunk into a bedpost. With a drill, I bored right through it. This was my first bedpost, and then I made the other three, inlaid with gold and silver and with ivory. I stretched ox leather straps across, dyed purple. Now I have told the secret trick, the token." And at that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed after 20 years. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him and kissed his face. And Odysseus held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. So we have a story that begins with weeping, with longing for oikos, and ends with weeping as oikos is restored. And it is a beautiful moment. And I love what Homer does here with the bed, because we get the story of an olive tree, which symbolically represents peace. And so there's peace that is the foundation of this home. He has built this home, and specifically their bedroom, their marriage bed, around this immovable object. And so it shows us what oikos ought to be. It ought to be steadfast, immovable, a safe place that you can return to. And so when he hears, "Just move the bed outside the room," he's fearful that what he knows was waiting for him at home has changed, that his oikos has been uprooted. And it doesn't. That's not the case. And so we get this beautiful moment at the end. But we see here just such a beautiful picture of what home ought to be and what it thankfully is for Odysseus and Penelope at the end of this story. So it's a beautiful picture, like I said, of their family, of home itself, the physical sense of home. This is a pretty good depiction. People really try to depict what this looked like, and I think this is one of the better representations. But I think it's really cool to have just a tree as your bedpost. It must have been beautiful. So to end, kind of tying it into our day and age now, human beings, today as well as over 2,000 years ago, we crave belonging. And we recognize that home and all that the word entails is vital for us to thrive. And that's hard sometimes, for home to be what we want it to be. But we know it's important. And though Homer's worldview was clearly very, very different from a Christian worldview, he talks about the gods and their interactions with the humans. Though it's different, I think he actually has found a true and good and beautiful thing in what he's talking about here with oikos. And it reminds me of something C.S. Lewis says. From a Christian perspective, we know that we long for a home too. And it is a home that we are waiting for and we have not reached yet. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity says this: most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life, to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. It's incredible to me how well this parallels the story of Odysseus, and how well our Christian walks and experience as we wait for oikos is a depiction of what it is to wait and to long for something. So a couple questions for you to consider. Are we actively waiting as we anticipate our eternal home? 2, are we nostalgic, in the Greek sense of the word, for the home that we have yet to reach? Are we yearning for it with an ache and a pain that recognizes it is good and we don't have it yet? And 3, how does our longing for a future home influence our present lives? So food for thought. One last note, as we're running out of time, one last note is that we have, if you found this lecture interesting and are interested in reading the Odyssey in its entirety, we have something called the Asynchronous Pacifica Book Club. Right now we have a book club that's running for 6 weeks in person, but life is busy, schedules are busy, and we recognize that some people need a little bit more flexibility, so we've started something called the Asynchronous Book Club, and we do it because reading alongside your students is valuable. We believe that when you read with your kids and you can connect on the things they're reading, literature does really beautiful things and creates really beautiful conversations. So it's worth doing. And if you are interested, here's how it works. You can start whenever you want. There's a link that you can go to, and it will run for 6 weeks, regardless of when you start. You'll receive an email once a week for 6 weeks. It'll provide details regarding the reading for the week, themes and questions to consider, and encouragement to keep reading. And you can find info in the weekly email that just got sent out. There's a section that talks about this book club, and you can also find it on the website. If you have any questions, you can ask myself or Dr. Robertson. And we recommend that, though you can start at any time, that you start soon, because you could finish it by the end of the semester if you do. This book is a worthwhile read. It is a beautiful story that no matter how many times I go through it, impacts me in a different way every single time. Thank you for your time and your attention. I hope you have a great rest of your night. That is all. I think we're out of time.